Well, good morning, everyone. Andy, thank you for the introduction, for the kind words. It's a pleasure to be here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with everyone. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give you a good overview of the AS9100 quality system standard within, and also talk about certification, how to go about getting certified. So that's the purpose of the talk here. The agenda, there's 4 key points that I really want to convey to you today. I'm going to talk about some key quality concepts that exist within the AS9100 standard. I'm also going to talk about what's called the 7 quality principles. So these are foundational principles that the AS9100 standard is built on. I'm going to give you a good high-level overview of the AS9100 standard. I mean, obviously, I can't dig too deep into it, but I certainly want you to leave here today with a good overview of what it contains and how it all works together to comprise a quality system. And then the last thing I want to show you is it's actually not that hard to become certified. I mean, that may sound crazy, but I've kind of found that to be true over the years. I think it's harder to remain certified, but it's actually not that hard to become certified. So I'm going to show you some steps that you go through to become certified. So I'll give you a little detail on that. Okay. So that's the agenda. Okay. So first of all, there's really 2. So the concept here is if you're in manufacturing, you have a quality system, all right? And your quality system is just a very simple definition. It's everything that you do. It's all the processes that exist within your organization. So all the activity that occurs. All right. So at some point you make the decision. We want our quality system to become certified to a standard. So there are 2 standards that serve the aerospace industry, and the first one is ISO 9001 2015. So ISO it's an international organization. They publish standards, and one of their main categories of standards is quality standards. I mean, they have different quality standards. Like if you have a laboratory, there is a standard that you could become certified to. But probably the one they're most famous for is 9001 2015, which is the standard for quality systems. Right. So, and then you have AS9100, which is ISO 9001 with additional content that is pertinent to the aerospace industries. So so there's a manual that's published, and what you can see here on the screen, the way the manual's written is that you have ISO language, and then you have AS9100 language. So the ISO language, you can look at the example here on the screen. The ISO language is just regular type. All right, but then the AS9100 language is italicized and it's bold. It's in bold type. All right, so every section, some sections just have ISO language. There's no additional AS9100 content. But when there is additional content, you'll see it italicized and bolded. Okay, so that's how the manual's laid out. Just to give you an overview of that. Okay. Two key concepts that I want to talk to you about today, and I think the reason why I call these key is there's a section in AS9100, it's section 511D. It's within the leadership section. And this is literally how it reads in the manual. And so top management shall demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the system by promoting the use of the process approach and risk-based thinking. So obviously, if top management is required to promote these, then they must be important. So therefore, top management needs to understand what these are. All right. So what are these? So the first one is called the process approach, and the process approach it's got three components to it. The first component is you have to determine the processes that exist within your system. Okay, so a system, I said this earlier, but a quality system, a very simple definition, a system is a collection of processes. All right, and the system produces an output which is received by a customer or customers. So that output could be a product, it could be a service, but within, so if you look at the picture here on the screen, you know, I just the way my brain sees this, I think of it as a box, and the box is the system, and within the box are your processes, and then there's two types of processes. There are your manufacturing processes, some people call them core processes, but they're directly involved. You could call them like the value added processes, but they're directly involved in making that output that goes to the customer. So examples could be like plating, welding, painting, assembly, machining. Those are all examples of manufacturing processes. And then we also have support processes. So they're indirectly involved. They support those core processes. So like quality assurance, human resources, production planning, purchasing, you could say like maintenance, you know, those, and leadership. I don't want to forget them. So leadership, I consider leadership as a process. All right. And then outside the box, you have customers that receive your output. And then you also have suppliers that feed the system with like services and material. Okay. So the first part of this process approach is, what are your processes? You have to be clear on what those are. Okay. So I would say typical process. I don't care how big or small you are. I don't care what type of manufacturing you're in. Everybody has pretty much the list that's on the left here. There's leadership, sales, production planning, production engineering, purchasing, quality, human resources, and then you could say, to me, those are the base processes that everyone does in some form or another. And then you have others like IT or maintenance. You know, I see those from time to time, you know, added as processes. Okay, so what are your processes? That's the first part of what is known as the process approach. So then the second component is, okay, now that I know what my processes are, now how do they interact with each other? So you have to understand that, because these processes all work together to create the output. Okay, so if you're not providing good output to your customers, and you're trying to understand why, you know, if your customers are complaining, then it's got to do you know, the reason is these processes aren't working well together, or maybe, you know, most of the processes are working well, but maybe one of them's not. So something is breaking down within your processes. Okay, so So if you look in the upper left-hand corner, section 4.4.2, this is right out of the AS9100 standard. So this is a requirement. So the word shall means requirement. So it says the organization shall maintain documented information, which means you got to write it down. That includes the sequence and interaction of these processes. So you have to document how your processes are sequenced and how they relate to each other. So what most organizations do, what I'm accustomed to seeing, is they'll draw a picture like you see on the screen here. And I call this a process interaction map. So it's a picture of your system. And it's a picture of the processes within your system. And it shows how they interact with each other. So the arrows that go from one process to another. So this makes it, this is great for auditing because I mean, this is an auditor's best friend. If I'm going to audit your system, you know, I would use this document to help me plan my audit for your system. But so you have to understand how your processes interact. That's the second component of the process approach. And then the third component is you have to describe each process. So another hard requirement in AS9100 in section 4.4.2, it says the organization shall maintain documented information. Again, that means you've got to write it down. That includes a description of the processes. So you have to describe your processes. It has to be documented. Okay. So here's a base definition of a process. So I said a system is a collection of processes. So a process transforms inputs into outputs. Right? That's kind of a basic definition of a process. But there's more. If you look at the picture here, this would be, for example, like a description of a quality process. So the details that you have to go into. So every process should have an owner. You know, that owner has the authority to make improvements to the process. Every process has inputs that are required and outputs that are expected. So you have to describe those. Every process needs resources, and resources basically include people and equipment. So you need to describe the people that are needed within the process and the equipment that's needed. Every process needs methods. So the methods are the details. So like the work instructions and the procedures. So that's where we're going to get all the details on how to carry out the process. And then every process has to have needs criteria, or most people think of that as like KPIs, key process indicators. Those are the measures we use to tell us how well the processes are performing. And we should be monitoring those measures. And if the KPIs are telling us that the processes are not working well, then we need to take action to improve those processes. And then the last part, the last detail that's required is risk and opportunity. So every process has risk, you know, things that could potentially go wrong. And then every process has opportunities for improvement. So that's part of your description, is to identify risk and opportunities that need to be addressed within each process. Okay. So that's the process approach. The other concept that is important is called risk-based thinking. So this was really, it's always been part of both standards. In the past, it was referred to as like preventive action. So that was like a big requirement, but now it's really, it's become more explicit. So there's a lot of language in ISO and AS9100 that talks about, you know, the concept of risk, you know, knowing what your risks are, managing them. So it's woven into the entire system now from start to finish. In fact, there's 2 levels of risk assessment that are required now. So the first level is what I call strategic. So this is at a leadership level. You know, just looking at the organization as a whole. You know, what risk exists, you know, for the organization. So so the section there is 6.1.1, and what it tells you to do is you have to determine what internal and external issues are, you know, what issues does the organization face. So some of those issues are internal, some of those issues are external, all right? And within all those issues, there are risks, and those, you know, things that, you know, that can affect the organization. So if we don't address those risks, either prevent them or mitigate them, obviously there could be consequences for the organization, all right? So that strategic level is important. And then the other level is a process level. So, you know, what I just talked about. So once you know what your processes are, part of describing those processes is to identify the risk that are inherent to each process. So there's language within the standards. So 4.4.1, which is an ISO section, and it tells you to determine the risk for your processes. But then you have an AS9100 section, which is 8.1.1, and it says it's a hard requirement that you have to plan, implement, and control a process for managing operational risk. So it's a lot of explicit language in both standards, you know, regarding risk. In fact, there's a section. It's an ISO section. It's section 6.1, and this gives us a structure for risk assessment. And I mean, this is something you're all pretty familiar with, I'm sure. But these would all be shalls. These are requirements. So first of all, you have to identify what your risks are. So when I talked about strategic risk and process risk, this is the structure you would use to assess the risk. So what are your risks? You have to identify them. And then you have to prioritize them in some way. So not all risks are equal. Some are greater than others. So it doesn't tell you how to prioritize them. So it could be something as simple as low, medium, or high, or it could be something as complex as a scoring system. So if you got any background with like an FMEA, that's pretty much what an FMEA is. But you could have a scoring system where you could come up with you could quantify the level of risk, right? But you have to prioritize them. And then once you do that, then you have to plan actions to address the risk. So what are you going to do about the risk? Are you going to try to prevent it, or are you just simply going to mitigate it? And then you have to implement the actions, and then once the action is completed, you have to check the effectiveness of the action. Did it work? So if your action was to prevent the risk, well, did it actually prevent it? All right, so you have to do that effectiveness check. Okay. Okay, so those are the 2 concepts. So now let's talk a little bit about what are known as the 7 quality management principles. So this is described in section 0.2 of AS9100. So both the standards, ISO and AS9100, are built on these principles. So they're pillars. Another way I look at these, they're themes. So if you read through the standards, you see these themes. They're talked about everywhere. So obviously they're important. So the 7 principles are customer focus, leadership, engagement of people, the process approach that we just talked about, improvement, evidence-based decision making, and relationship management. So here's a question, and you can kind of answer it yourself. Are you good at these within your organization? You know, I think that's a question that every organization should answer. You know, how are we at each of these principles? So one thing I've done in the past, so I teach a lot of, I would call them leadership overview, like organizations will ask me to come in and I'll just meet with their top management group and I'll give them an overview of the standards. I mean, similar to what I'm doing here. And something I've done in the past is I'll give them a survey on these principles and I'll have them rate themselves. So when I ask the question, are you good at these? Well, I use this survey to kind of help them answer the question. So this is just an excerpt of the survey. So this would be for customer focus. So I give them like criteria, you know, to rate themselves by, and then I put it on a scale of 0 to 10. So 10 being, hey, I think we're world class at doing this, and a 0 would be, hey, we don't do this at all. So so I have them fill this out and rate themselves. And what this is I've done enough of these that I've got some data, and so I just throw this up here for perspective. You know, most organizations rate themselves fairly highly on customer focus. And so you can see the hierarchy here. You know, at the other end is the process approach, improvement. You know, the process approach, in my experience, most organizations don't really understand what that means. So that I think that's why that score is always lower. But you can kind of see the pecking order here. And again, I would ask you the question, you know, where do you think you fall within this? If you could kind of rate yourself on these 7 principles, you know, how would you score yourself? So that's just food for thought for you. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through the AS9100 standard. I'm going to give you a good overview of the contents. So first of all, here's the outline. One of the things I like about the listen, I've kind of grown up through all this. I mean, my background, I'm not like most of people. I mean, when I started in all this, I kicked and screamed. I didn't really see the value in it. And then someone told me that I had to be an auditor. And so I was an internal auditor and I didn't want to do that. But then when I started doing audits and, you know, I really started to kind of get it, you know, this whole quality system idea. I mean, I started to understand it. So, but it took me, you know, I've evolved through this. So like one of the things and it took me a while to see this, but the way these standards are laid out, they're laid out according to the Plan, Do, Check, Act, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. I mean, that's generally regarded as, so the acronym is PDCA, and it's often called the cycle of continuous improvement. Right, and that certainly is that's one of the principles we just talked about, improvement. So we always want our quality system to improve. Okay, so the way we go about improving is obviously we have to plan. All right, we have to come up with a plan for improvement. So if we talk about planning our quality system, well, there's 3 sections: sections 4, 5, and 6. And those are all planning sections. Those are sections, and the requirements within those sections are all, you know, planning requirements, you know, to help you set up your system. And then the do, which is to implement the system, well, that's sections 7 and 8. So most of the requirements are within those 2 sections. So support and operation. And then once we implement the quality system, we have to check the implementation. All right, so we have to measure ourselves. You know, how are we doing? How is our system effective? Is it not effective? All right, so that's section 9, which is called performance evaluation. And then based on what we learned from our checks, we have to take action. All right, and we have to take action to improve the system. And that's section 10, which is called improvement. Okay. All right. So section 4 is called context of the organization. So it's a planning section, and there's 4 subsections within 4. So the first section is 4.1, and the requirement is you have to determine your internal and external issues. I mentioned these earlier, but this is a strategic action. So, and this would be very much your leadership that would do this. So you have to look at your organization, because what you're doing here is you're building the context in which your quality system exists. So part of that is there are issues internally and externally that affect your organization. And they can affect you positively and negatively. But as a leadership group, you have to be aware of what those issues are. And then you have to monitor those issues because they can change. So some examples, I mean, we all are very much familiar with these. External, the supply chain issues that a lot of organizations are struggling with right now. That is a major external issue. And then an example of an internal issue could be worker morale. All right, so but again, what are the issues? And then you have to monitor these issues. Okay, and then section 4.2 is called determine interested parties. So the concept here is your system exists. There are multiple parties that have an interest in how well your system performs. It's not just your customers. I mean, there are other entities that have requirements of your system. So who are those parties? I think most people, if I said the word stakeholder, I think most people associate with that, but ISO calls it interested parties. And each one of these parties has a requirement. So you have to make sure that your system is meeting the requirements of these parties. So examples like shareholders, I mean, that's kind of an obvious interested party, and they obviously want you to remain profitable. So that would be their requirement. And then customers, I mean, that's an obvious interested parties, and they want you to meet their technical requirements. Okay. All right. And then you have section 4.3, which is called determine the scope. So you have to create what's called a scope statement. It's a written statement, and it basically has to say 2 things. It has to describe the products that you make, and it has to describe the AS9100 sections that apply to your system. So if you have some flexibility here. If there is a section within AS9100 that doesn't apply to you, you can take exception to it, which means, okay, it doesn't apply to us. We will not be audited to that section, but you have to write that down. You have to document that exception. That would be part of your scope. And then section 4.4 is called quality system and its processes. So this is where that process approach comes in. You have to determine what your processes are. You have to determine how they interact, and you have to describe them, right? So all that has to be documented. Okay. So this is a diagram. This is in the standard, the AS9100 standard, and it's a picture of the system. So there's the box, kind of what I showed you earlier. So if you look outside the box on the left side, you've got sections 4.1 and 4.2. So those are key inputs into your system. All right. Again, they're planning activities. And to help you build an effective system, you have to go through 4.1 and 4.2 because they're critical inputs for you. All right, section 5 is called leadership, and this is the core of your system. This section used to be called management responsibility, but they changed it when ISO changed. To 2015, they changed it to leadership. So there is a stronger emphasis now on leadership, which I think is a good thing. So not a big section. There's only 3 subsections here. The first one is 5.1. It's called leadership and commitment. And it starts off with a statement that says, top management shall. And then it gives a big list of the different ways that top management shows commitment to the quality system. So it's really prescriptive. So if like for instance, when I audit organizations, you know, I'll interview like a member of top management, and I'll take that list in section 5.1 and I'll ask him, are you doing this? Are you doing this? Are you doing this? So it's there's not a procedure you can write for that. It just boils down to, how is the organization led? You know, what is the level of commitment to the quality system? So that's important. And then 5.2 is the quality policy. So I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with that. It's like your mission statement in a sense. It's similar to that, but top management has to create it and they have to communicate it. All right, so that's another role of your top management. And then the last subsection is 5.3. It's called roles, responsibilities, and authority. So it's basically like your organizational chart, and then the roles within that chart have to be defined. So for instance, like a quality manager would be one of your key roles. So what are the quality manager's responsibilities and what are his or her authorities? So all that has to be defined. Okay. Okay, section 6 is called planning, and it's got 3 subsections. So the first section is 6.1. So that's where we get the structure for addressing risk and opportunities. I went through that earlier. Section 6.2 is quality objectives. So these are just looking at your organization as a whole. You know, what are your key objectives? I always equate it to when you go to the doctor and, you know, I don't care what's wrong with you. When you walk in the door, there's 4 or 5 things they're going to measure, because that's giving them an indication of what's going on within your system. So what are those for your organization? So examples could be like on-time delivery, you know, no customer complaints. It could be safety. You know, we want a safe work environment. Those are pretty typical quality objectives. And they have to be measurable. That's important. They have to be measurable. And if you're not meeting them, you have to have action plans to meet them. And then the last section is 6.3. It's planning of changes. So change is a big deal, right? And there's risk inherent with change. So when you make changes, you have to do them in a planned manner. And that's really basically what 6.3 says. Then you got section 7. This is a support section. So it talks about resources like people, infrastructure. So infrastructure is equipment, work environment, measuring and monitoring. So that would be like your gauges, your measuring instruments. So a lot of language on resources. You make sure you got the right resources in place. Competence, which is like the training section. You know, it's more than just training. It's making sure that your employees are competent to do the work, and you have to have records of competence. Awareness, I mean, this is a big part of the employee engagement, which is one of those 7 principles. There's a list of key things that people need to be aware of. Communication, so there's guidance in 7.4. It gives you guidance on how to structure your key communications. And then 7.5 is called documented information. So this is like your document control. So all the documents that you need and that you use, you know, make sure that you control them so that you're using the right versions. And then you got section 8. So this is the big section. It's called operations. So you have, so 8.1, this is basically production planning, which is a process. So that section gives you details on production planning. Section 8.2 is what I call the sales process. So it's requirements for products and services. 8.3 is what I call engineering. So it's design and development of products and services. 8.4 is purchasing. So it gives you details on how to control your suppliers, how to manage your suppliers. 8.5 is what I call production. That's a production process. 8.6 gives us details on how to release products for shipment. So I would call that like a quality process. And then 8.7 gives us details on how to control, like if something fails a test, how do we manage it so that it doesn't get accidentally shipped? So I would include that as part of a quality process. All right, so that's section 8. And then you have 9, which is the check section. So key things that are talked about here within section 9.1. So one of the things you have to measure is customer satisfaction. So you have to have a method of measuring the degree of satisfaction. And then you have internal audits, which is a big part of your quality system. So that's section 9.2. And then section 9.3 is management review. So your top management has to review the status of the quality system at periodic intervals. So the two key ones there are auditing and management review. Okay, and then the last section is 10, improvement. This is the act section. So 10.2 is the corrective action. So obviously one action is to correct something. So that gives us a structure for problem solving. And then 10.3 is continual improvement. All right, so corrective action is obviously when something's quote unquote broken, but if it's not broken, we still need to improve. So we want to continually improve the system. So that section 10.3 gives us guidance on how to continually improve the quality system. Okay, and then the last slide here this is what I would call the approach for AS9100 certification. So there's really 13 steps to go through. And like I said earlier, it's really not that hard to get certified. I mean, it's obviously takes work. It's harder to maintain it. But if you just kind of go down through the list, you have to define your top management, be clear in who they are, build your context, which are those issues that we talked about and your interested parties. You have to do that strategic risk assessment. You have to set your quality policy and your objectives. You have to determine the scope of the system. So 1 through 5, all that needs to be documented. Those are like major planning activities. And then you develop your processes. So determine what they are, create your map, describe your processes, and then do the risk assessment for your processes. And then develop the methods within those processes. So write your procedures and your forms and your instructions. Then you would write your quality manual. You're going to create a master list of documentation. And then, so at that point, you're documented, and then you want to implement it. So you would train everybody to the documentation. And then after you're using your system for a while, then you would start to audit it. You would conduct your first audit and do your first management review. And then when you think you're ready to be audited for certification, that happens in 2 stages. There's what's called a readiness audit, which is like a paperwork audit. The auditors just want to make sure that you've got the system in place. And then they'll come back later and do what's called a stage 2 audit, which is when they'll come on site and they're going to go through your system, and they'll make the determination then whether to certify you or not. Okay. Okay, so that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
Hey, Stephen, this is Stephen Estemborski. The only question that I've seen come in so far is about the slides. Will we be able to share these slides, or should we just rely on the recording? Because we did record this. So
I can share it. I'll send you a copy.
Great. We'll